Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer for HIS 240. Today, we're really going to elevate our historical thinking. We're stepping way beyond just memorizing names and dates to explore a massive, fascinating paradox. How a land defined by wild, frontier freedom simultaneously established some deeply conservative institutions, and how the very next generation completely reimagined that past. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be hitting four main concepts: the paradox of statehood, ordering the frontier, state power versus federal law, and finally, myth-making in the West. All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the paradox of statehood, focusing on democracy and enslavement. Picture this. It's April 1792, and 45 delegates arrive in Danville to draft Kentucky's first constitution. They are facing a really restless population that is demanding a voice. George Nicholas, who's often called the father of the first Kentucky Constitution, realized that because there were so many landless folks in the state, he absolutely had to appeal to common freemen. And the result? Kentucky becomes the very first state in the Union to guarantee universal white male suffrage, regardless of property ownership. Now, for the 1790s, that is a radically democratic step. But here is the paradox. This exact same convention also enshrined deep conservatism. Led by Nicholas, and despite some really fierce opposition from anti-slavery ministers like Reverend David Rice, the delegates voted 26-16 to strictly protect the institution of slavery. They literally denied the state the power to emancipate enslaved people without compensating the owners. So they effectively entrenched the institution just to protect the property rights of the elite. You have radical democracy for white men sitting right side by side with constitutional bondage. Okay, moving on to Section 2. Ordering the frontier and establishing social control. To really grasp this next shift, we have to look at the incredibly chaotic, fast-growing frontier population right after the state was formed. As you can see from this demographic data, early Kentucky was diverse and booming. We're talking English, Scots-Irish, Irish, Welsh, and German immigrants just pouring in. You've got traveling merchants, squatters, and a lot of highly ambitious young men looking to make their mark. The state's elites looked out at this largely landless, highly restless public, and they realized something quickly. To maintain power and stability, they had to impose strict social order. The old frontier days of, informal peace, those were over. It was time for codification. So state institutions used the 1798 codes of law to legally define white men's rights, strengthen patriarchy, and basically override informal local customs. They passed a comprehensive slave code that severely restricted the mobility of enslaved people, barring them from testifying in court or owning guns. At the same time, they passed a marriage code. Now, out on the frontier, marriages and divorces were often pretty informal. But the state stepped in and mandated licensed Christian ministers for ceremonies and strictly restricted a woman's right to own property or enter contracts on her own. On top of all that, they empowered state appellate courts. By leaning heavily on strict English common law, these higher courts started overturning the informal, kind of common sense rulings of local county squires. Basically, the frontier was being systematically ordered from the top down. Which brings us to Section 3, state power versus federal law and the factional divide. So this local factionalism, this brewing tension between the elite and the masses, it quickly escalates onto the national stage. On one side, we have figures like George Nicholas, representing the Democratic Republicans. They drew their power from local farmers and merchants, they heavily supported Thomas Jefferson, and they championed local rights, especially the right to navigate the Mississippi River for trade. On the flip side, you have Humphrey Marshall, representing the Federalists. The Federalists were deeply suspicious of the democratic impulses of everyday people. In fact, Marshall's elitism made him such a target of mob violence that a crowd in Frankfort once literally carried him to the river to dunk him. Marshall actually only escaped by joking that, hey, according to Baptist rules, they couldn't baptize him before he gave his religious experience. It made the mob laugh, and they let him go. But this divide wasn't just local theater, right? It was fundamentally about who held the ultimate power, the state or the federal government. And this leads to a massive moment for us to analyze. When the Federalist-controlled U.S. Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798, which were laws literally designed to suppress political critics and restrict immigrants, Kentuckians were outraged. John Breckinridge traveled to Virginia, met with Thomas Jefferson, and secretly drafted the 1798 Kentucky Resolutions. He pushed these through the state assembly using the compact theory of government. This is the idea that states themselves could determine if the federal government had overstepped its constitutional bounds. Breckinridge was laying the intellectual groundwork for states' rights, arguing it was the right and duty of the states to nullify federal acts to protect their citizens. Now, they didn't actively nullify the laws right then, But man, this philosophy would have monumental and ultimately devastating consequences for the nation in the decades to come. But watch this incredible pivot, because it is a masterclass in political pragmatism. The very same Democratic Republicans, folks like Jefferson and Breckinridge, who had just fiercely argued for incredibly strict, limited federal power, completely shifted gears in 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase. Why? Well, because Kentucky farmers absolutely needed access to the Mississippi River and the Port of New Orleans just to survive economically. So when Napoleon offered to sell the entire Louisiana territory, Jefferson and Breckinridge pushed the purchase through immediately, even though Jefferson himself admitted the Constitution made no provision for acquiring foreign territory. It's wild to see, but local economic needs and practical trade completely trumped pure constitutional ideology. And finally, let's look at Section 4, Myth-Making in the West and the First Generation. Think about the generation coming of age in the early 1800s. They didn't fight in the Revolutionary War, and they didn't settle those dangerous early stations, but they inherited the state. And as they aged, this generation actively paved over a really messy, violent reality with a highly romanticized frontier myth. By 1826, you even have bas-reliefs of Daniel Boone being placed in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, transforming figures like Boone into these legendary national heroes. This generation consumed literature like John Filson's tales and James Fenimore Cooper's novels. They were essentially constructing a nostalgic, sanitized version of their parents' struggles, turning a really gritty fight for survival into a grand, romantic American mythology. But this created an unbelievable disconnect between memory and action. On one hand, women were publishing cookbooks like The Kentucky Housewife, which was full of rustic, frontier-sounding Indian recipes, like Indian pudding and Indian hoe cakes, while men sat around reading novels about the untamed wilderness. But the reality? It was entirely different. The leaders of this exact same generation, men like Henry Clay and a succession of Whig governors, were aggressively pushing for 19th century modernization. Clay championed his famous American system at the federal level, demanding protective tariffs, a national bank, and massive federal investments. And back home in Kentucky, they were pouring money into turnpikes, the Louisville and Portland Canal, and the Lexington and Ohio Railroad. They romanticized a rustic pioneer past while simultaneously building a modern commercial economy completely detached from it. So as we wrap up this explainer for His 240, I want to leave you with this provocative question to chew on for your notes. What is the difference between the Kentucky that was and the Kentucky that was remembered? We've seen a state born in the wild paradox of radical democracy for white men and the rigid protection of slavery. We've watched elites impose order through strict legal codes and fight for local trade rights even when it totally contradicted their own constitutional philosophies. And ultimately, we've seen a new generation build railroads and canals, all while telling themselves romantic stories of men in coonskin caps. I really want you to think deeply about how a state builds its future by actively mythologizing its past. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep questioning the history you think you know.